The United States lacks a clear governing body regulating the crypto asset market, with analog laws policing the digital world, and misconceptions among lawmakers abound. These are some of the concerns addressed by Prime Trust's latest State of Regulation report. Joining us now to discuss that report is Jeremy Sheridan. He's the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at crypto custody and infrastructure firm Prime Trust. Jeremy, thanks for joining us. So it's a really interesting report. I had a chance to glance over it, and you begin by kind of outlining some of the problems right now, in that there is no clear regulation in the United States. As I mentioned, analog laws are here kind of policing the digital world, and misconceptions among lawmakers about crypto still exist. Maybe you can explain some of the problems here.
Yeah, Christine, Emily, good to see you again. Thanks for having me. So you hit on two major concerns that we talk about in the report. The first is the analog laws, starting first and foremost with the Howey test being a 90-year-old construct that we're applying to 21st century technology. But it goes far beyond that into other categories, such as the 1980 Paperwork Reduction Act, 1966 Freedom of Information Act, the tax code that's been addressed in the Infrastructure Jobs Act that will be very burdensome for digital asset industries, as well as even the attempts to modernize through the Modern Money Transmission Modernization Act that's applied at the state level, but is applied at varying degrees and with different interpretations by different states. So what we talk about is a lack of regulatory efficiency that uses these analog laws to apply to the evolving technology today. And in terms of the narrative, the second part of your question, I think that's the biggest challenge for us in the industry, this misrepresentation or false narrative about the industry solely being used for illicit activity.
It's also interesting, given that SEC Chair Gary Gensler has said there is no need for further guidance in crypto. The guidance is already there based on precedent. And in your report, you mentioned, there is talk of, or suggestion at least, that perhaps a whole new agency should be created to address digital assets. So I wonder about the likelihood of that ever happening.
Well, that would be a long-term process for sure. But I think what it speaks to is, Ryan Selkis has brought this up about maybe a Web3 commission. I think there's ideas about a crypto czar that could be very helpful. Trying to force into existing frameworks or existing regulators the technology that we're dealing with that doesn't always conform to those constructs is in a lot of ways the challenges that we're seeing. And having a novel approach to a very novel technology may be a more appropriate way to do it based on the function of the assets that we're looking at. We need legislation that recognizes the complexity of the technology that doesn't squarely fit into one regulatory body. And probably most importantly with that is we'd like to see a regulatory body that has an empowering mindset as opposed to a constricting mindset. The reports that followed the president's EO all seem to want to put really strict requirements and constraints on the industry. The one exception, the Department of Commerce, that had a really empowering and uplifting approach to it, is something we'd like to see from the legislative and regulatory space as well.
So in theory, everything you're saying totally makes sense. Like, we need some sort of agency that's more dedicated to this. But, one of the criticisms of this proposal, which, has been, because this genre of proposal has been floated around a lot. One of the criticisms is that agency wouldn't necessarily replace the agencies that already exist. It would just be another agency, right? So, one of the problems with U.S. crypto policy is there's already so many chefs in the kitchen, right? They're all sort of like doing their own thing, and then so if we just created another body, that would just kind of add to that chaos. So, I mean, how do you address, because that seems like a reasonable concern, right? It's not like these other agencies are just going to sort of step back. More likely, we would just have another player in the field.
Well, I think you can do it if you have sound policy and sound legislative approach. I think some of the challenges you see with the bills that are being proposed now is they still create that exact environment you just described. There isn't enough of a clear line of responsibility between, in most cases, the CFTC or the SEC, and we're right back where we are with what some of our colleagues call these line drawing exercises to try and determine whether it's going to be ruled a security or a commodity. I think if you craft the proper legislation, you can achieve that.
All right, and so the latter part of your report talks about 3 pieces of U.S. legislation to watch out for. Maybe you could go over quickly those and, how they could help shape the regulatory landscape going forward.
Yeah, the primary pieces that we're looking at are the RFIA, commonly referred to as the Lomas-Gillibrand bill, the DCEA, the Digital Commodities Exchange Act, as well as the DCCPA, Digital Commodities Consumer Protection Act, which is the Stabenow bill. I think each of them have strengths, and ultimately what I think will happen is there will be some omnibus or Jobs Act type approach to incorporating elements of all of these bills. But I think, looking at clearly defining a primary regulator over the space, all of them identify the CFTC, with allowing still the SEC to have regulatory authority in cases where the asset is determined to be a security, but also some elements of the bills about sandboxes, clarifying tax rules, voluntary registration, as well as a clear line of distinction about preempting state laws, which is part of the problem we're seeing across federal, state, and international lines. All of them, I think, have great assets and great benefits to the industry of clear regulation, providing rules of the road and guardrails for us to be able to continue to grow and innovate.